ahead.
Okay.
Okay, welcome to the session on critical relationality as intentionality, designing for inclusion. Those of you joining us on the video. And we are just taking a minute for people to share on the chat window what comes to mind, or what do they think of when they think of the word relationality, and what comes to their mind, or what it means to use the phrase critical consciousness. Justine, do you want to read a couple of them out? And
Yeah. So from Gabriella, we have relationality is holding space for the other, and critical consciousness is understanding things from a historical and social perspective, looking further than what is apparent. And is it Marlies? Okay, yeah. So I love this. No idea what critical consciousness is. Feels like reflexivity of thinking about thinking. And relationality is how to connect and exchange with others. Let's see a few more here. Critical consciousness, inequality, and taking action. Maybe relationality, a way of being in the world, putting relationships at the center as the most important thing. Critical consciousness, being aware of presences and absences. I think I missed one. Oh, yeah, go ahead, Saliha.
No, I was also going to say that if you want to say, I don't know, just like Marilee said, I really appreciate that, because I do think these are cultural terms and they belong in some regions of the world more than others, as a way of framing our attention as to what matters to us. You want to read a couple more?
Yeah, so there's a couple more about relationality, paying attention to the space between, engaging with others with a focus on the connection between, and then additionally, relations between students and teachers and management, and love between relationship. Yeah. There was also one I missed up here from Judith. Relationality is emergent. It belongs in the we and not I's. It's in the middle of us, so to speak, as that energy that connects or binds us.
Thank you for that, Judith.
Yeah.
And everybody else, yeah. And then
I like the continually being open to other perspectives, a hand held out. Another way to think about relationality, care.
So another is relationality by birth. I feel close to which talent, hobby, property, etc. So, Justine, what is it for you?
Yeah, great question. So many of the things I think folks are speaking to here around relationality would resonate for me as well as I think about relationality. I think someone in the chat put that it's the thing that I hold most important. So my connection with and sort of like way of being with another person, human, is usually the center of what I'm focusing on when I'm in any interaction. And I say that because that sort of follows how I think about critical consciousness. At least here in the States, critical consciousness has really been a word that has kind of asked folks to focus on social and political and cultural contexts that inform people's lives, or that might shape people's lives and how they make meaning. And I think particularly in the field that I work in, which is marriage and family therapy, there has been an increasing call for therapists to really locate and focus on those in the therapeutic work that we do with clients. And I think also in an educational aspect as professors, there's been this emphasis on us really highlighting the social and political contexts as we teach students. And Saliha, stop me if I go too far, but I think some of the ways we've been encouraged to do that oftentimes for me lose some of the relational pieces and the connective pieces between us, and they become more about the ideas than they do about the people. And so in my work with students and with clients, I have felt this, I have felt really much more responsibility to the immediate relationship I'm in, and not necessarily sacrificing that at the cost of some of these larger contexts, but then also feeling a lot of responsibility to be attentive to those
Mhm.
larger contexts.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think I'm at home with my fellow social constructionist, and I think we've also had a lot of criticism that we don't attend to
Yeah.
the socio-political, which surprises me. And I think it is in some ways a language game from Wittgenstein's idea of like how we are oriented, how we are socialized to think about context. And for me, relationality is what people do together when they come together and what that doing makes in the world. And I think about relationality from the communicative action perspective, from communication theories, that communication is not sending and receiving, but it's making and doing of who I am, the context I'm in, and the world around us. So when I think about it in that way, what falls under critical thinking, critical consciousness, is not just analysis of the socio-political conditions. It is a way of engaged action. It's looking at history, and it's also looking at what's coming into being. And so for me, they've not been separate. I was born and raised in India, and I came here to the US for my PhD. And I have a lot of fellow Indians in this conference, and I have to just give a shout out and say it's fabulous to see you all here. Because I think
Same here.
Same here. Oh, good. Because I think in some ways, language was very central in India, in my upbringing, of noticing how culture and the socio-political conditions are spoken or not spoken about. And we don't see how the personal is political. We don't see how who I am becoming is from my social-cultural socialization of coming into myself, whatever myself is, and that process is continuous. It doesn't stop, right? One quick example, and I'm just going to go political, whatever that means, is in terms of growing up in Delhi. There's a lot of sexual harassment in the public spaces. And the way it is named is Eve teasing. And that naming, I think, is a kind of making the problem a small problem. It's just teasing. Don't worry. It doesn't get to this larger context of how women are seen in our society. And I think if you look at another big problem around how women are valued, right, from infancy or birth, I should say, or pre-birth, where we might even go for feticide if it's a female because the male child is valued more than a female. This sounds very political. I'm already entering into the political, but it was what shaped me. So for me, doesn't disjunct, because how language and culture are in relationship, it shapes how I'm in relationship with other human beings. And what stories get lifted and not. So I've gone big, Justine. You're just going to have to interrupt me and say, so what does this all have to do with teaching and learning? But
yeah. I was just going to ask that. No, I'm just kidding.
So take me somewhere, or take us somewhere with what I've thrown out, because
yeah. So I would let's maybe, if that's okay, let's head the conversation in that direction for just a moment of how are you thinking in speaking to that now, the political is personal. How does that sort of shape then the ideas and the way that you bring yourself to your teaching?
So yeah, I think they're not separate. Mm-hmm. And the separation and pitting of them in especially the US context, in the way we think about relationality as separate from criticalness, is part of the problem that we have to do this session. Mm-hmm. So for me, I think I like what you said, Justine. It's like sometimes we get tied up in the concepts and not in the stories of those concepts.
That's
when
right.
we think about raising awareness, like in our field in marriage and family therapy, one of the trends I notice in education is, especially at conferences, identify yourself by locating your social location.
Yes.
So that what that would mean is, I would say I'm a brown woman from India, and just as an example, immigrant brown woman from India who has her PhD. Now, what does that mean? It still leaves it for all of you to fill in the gaps of what those things mean. There is no story in there.
Mm-hmm.
But previously, when I started to talk about growing up in India and how that was, I think that is a richer story to speak to what it means to be a brown woman from India.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And I don't even see myself as a brown woman in India until I come to the US and use the language of being brown here, where it's spoken in terms of black and white, and then color in terms of racism comes into the conversation. And yet we have colorism in India very much saying what, like, fair, white is more beautiful, right? There is that piece that's changing, but it's still a thing there. So I can relate to the issues of racism here. And so for me in teaching and learning, it's like, how do we talk? How do you open up the spaces that we can have these larger cultural conversations in intimate, personal ways, but not lose sight of the sociocultural production of self, if that makes sense. So that's the challenge for me.
Yes. Yeah. And I'm absolutely right. That I think I'm along on the same wavelength when I think about how do we come to the classroom in a way that holds stories about identity that aren't completely scripted by these larger categorical ways of understanding people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe not even understanding people, but categorizing people,
Mm-hmm.
and then making meaning out of those categories without ever taking the moment to hear the story of who this person is and how they've become who they become.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly shaped by those larger contexts, right? From a social constructionist perspective, I think we're always holding an awareness about how that interplay is happening,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not reducing people down to the categories.
Right. Yeah.
And so I think that for me as an educator, when I'm maybe particularly when I'm teaching classes that specifically are asking of me as an educator to highlight the categories, and help students learn about how those categories shape experience and shape identity. I feel like there is a different kind of dance almost maybe that I do have to do in some of those classes.
Mm-hmm.
And the classes I'm referring to are like when I'm teaching therapists a diversity class.
Mm-hmm.
When I'm teaching new therapists, like I'll teach the gender and sexuality class. And so there is somewhat like, there seems to be this expectation. It's interesting. It's like an expectation from the curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
as if it's a person, that I should be teaching these ideas in a particular way. And if I were to do that, then I think I lose the person who's in the room. And we become much more focused on the categories.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, it's like when I go into the room, some folks might look at the room and just see the identity of the bodies and automatically assume a kind of context that's going to be created. Mm-hmm. And so it's maybe for me as a teacher, I go in with a holding an awareness about that, but also not trying to hold at bay some like automatic conclusions about what might be waiting in this space, given the identities of the people in the room.
So can I ask you for an example of how you, I hear you as not holding assumptions. How might you make it public that if I was a student in your classroom, how would I know about this kind of juggling that you're doing?
Yeah, it's funny. I do hold assumptions, right? And I think I make those explicit. I think I go public with those with my students. And so sometimes sometimes I talk with my students about the process behind the scenes of how I prepare for a lesson or how I prepare for an activity, and letting them know, like sort of letting them in on the secret, quote unquote, of like what's behind my thinking and how I'm structuring my class. that's almost more the learning than the activity itself. Because they're able to see kind of the different things I'm holding in tension, right? So maybe like a more practical example is in the United States, we do have a lot of conversation. Maybe folks, some of you are aware about how we have this ongoing debate about critical race theory in the United States right now. And in some places, it's been determined that it's not allowed to be taught in schools. That's interesting because it's not taught in schools anyway. So this is a little bit, this tension has been created. But
can I ask you in one sentence, can you say
yeah.
what is critical race theory for those of us who don't know what it is?
Yeah, let me try. That's a great question.
No, it's a hard one. Sorry.
Critical race theory is really about identifying the historical roots of white supremacy, and how that has been an organizing factor in all of the ways in the United States, and how that has positioned different racial groups in different ways to have access to privileges or not. So it's, yeah.
You're good. That? You're good.
I was just going to add in other parts of the world too.
Fair. Yeah. Very much right. My context for understanding some of that larger racial conversation is very state-bound for sure. And we also know that whiteness has had a global organizing impact as well. So an example of that might be that, when I am trying to facilitate a reflective activity about one's cultural identity or the stories from their culture which have shaped them, or the experiences they've had because of their ethnic or racial heritage. When I am in a classroom and I'm thinking about how to invite students to reflect on those experiences for them personally, I am aware that there is power I have, not only as an instructor, but as a white instructor in deciding who speaks first, right? Do I take some ownership over how that process happens? Do I invite minoritized or students of color to speak first because often their voices aren't first?
And as a male.
What's that?
White, but as a male instructor.
Yeah, well, I appear male, but I'm actually a queer person. So there is a shifting power dynamic as I sort of visually present differently. Yes, people will experience me that way. So I'm also accounting for that as well. So I let students know, right? I'm transparent with them. If I ask white students to speak first about their experience, does that afford them more privilege and power, or is that asking them to make themselves vulnerable first? And is that in some way you flipping the power dynamic? And so, right, or if I ask students of color to speak first, is that sort of making more space for their voices to be heard, or is that potentially reproducing this idea of them having to speak and teach? And so I kind of open that process up to the students about what's organizing my thoughts about how to make decisions to facilitate the in-class conversation, and I invite feedback, right? So it's kind of like, right, according to critical race theory, if I do it this way, it might mean this. If we take a more relational perspective and we make some different decisions, what might be the consequences or differences if we did that? So it's like I invite a conversation about the activity, and that's more important than the actual activity itself. Is that a helpful example, Saliha?
Yes, and I have to mute myself because my dog is barking. I apologize. I'm home alone with her. Yeah.
I have kittens back here too, so people will probably see kittens flying up and down.
Rather quiet, I should say.
To Lilliput.
Ah, yes, Renee has met her. Yeah, I think that's a good example. At least it's a parallel example I have where this semester, again, I'm in the midst of doing this kind of activity where students have to make, as family therapists, one of the ideas of training is that we have to look at our own families and look at our own cultures and our context as a way of becoming therapists. So given that, the students have to make what we call a cultural genogram. and they have to reflect on their ethnicity and where they came from and what matters to them. And I have them read a chapter. It's called the Ethnicity Handbook for Family Therapists. And that's not the title, but it's a book that writes about every ethnicity, and still something's always missing. And they have to read that and say, where do they see themselves or not in that chapter? So it's a way to bring that critical reflection of how might we notice what is ethnicity? How do we even construct this construct within one's own cultural identity? So a lot of interesting things happen in that moment. And inviting a conversation around the assignment and the reading itself is a very similar thing, where like one of the students was saying, this is no longer true for my generation. And I'm like, let's write to the editor, let's talk about this, right? And that way of starting to say, it's not the book that defines me, but the story of where I am in relationship to the narrative, and then bringing that to the clinical world, which is our clients are not demographics. They're not male, female, queer, in terms of gender or sexual orientation or race or ethnicity, but there are stories there. And how do we create a context? And that bridge is really hard, because getting to our own self is hard enough, but when it comes to the clinical, they'll pull back into the demographic. And they collapse more into the discourse of therapy as emotional talk, which those of us who are family therapists know it isn't related to that only. So I'll pause on that's the complexity I'm swimming with, and I can share a couple of more examples of how I then engage that. Like you do, we talk about it, but it's also process. Yeah.
Real quickly, there is a comment in the chat about how we are defining family. What do we mean when we're saying family?
Thank you. Thanks, Elsa.
Yes.
Again, that's unpacked in class. Everything from family that we adopt to family that we're born into, to pets as family, people that we bring in. And I think that, Elizabeth, were you going to say some more?
Oh, I was just going to say that it is something that I struggle with. I work a lot and have studied alongside people living with dementia for a long time, and the expectation that family speaks for them, that they have this label that just erases all personhood, and then we say, oh well, they have family speaks for them, just ask the family. And it's something that I have trouble addressing, teaching. Learners have particular ideas of what that means, and it's used in ways that is a conversation. So it's something that I have a visceral reaction to, actually. So when I hear it, I want to know what you mean by that.
Well, that's exactly what we want to do, and go there. Like, I think let's open the floor, right?
Yeah, let's do that.
Because people are asking about that, and this is it. What we're doing here is the way I would be in teaching and learning, that I've come with an agenda and idea, but then the conversation arrives because of our language, because of the way we are constructing things, and how do we open up space for that? So I know, Gabriella, you said too that you have a question.
Yes, I have a question for, I believe, well, either of you can answer, either Justine or Saliha or both. A little bit of context while we're talking about context. I am an educator starting, it's only my second year teaching psychology, and I am based in Puerto Rico. And if you know a little bit about our political situation, we're a US colony. And here in Puerto Rico, you will see that very little people have access to learning English. So the people that know English are privileged, such as I am, to be able to talk and speak English. But at the same time, at the university where I'm teaching, they require me to give classes in English, even though half of my classroom or even more don't speak English fluently. So I just think that there are certain things that are a little bit more flexible in terms of how we can transgress these political underpinnings. and others are not so flexible. For example, I am required to give this class in English. So I was just wondering how you guys manage those unnegotiables politically.
How about we open? That's a great question rather than just us talking. I think this would be a great place to go. How do you transgress that which is required of you? Thank you. Great question, Gabrielle.
If I could just jump in, I would say that there is, like I was saying in the other conferences from yesterday and from today, that having a relationship perspective as a teacher means standing in the margins a lot of the times. And that means playing with or pushing all these boundaries of what is illegal, what is correct, what is permitted. And so I would just play with language. I would play with languages because there are some articles and there are some ways of doing psychology or even comparing. There is an article in English, but there's this version in Spanish. For example, you could take the journal of the International Journal of Collaborative Practices, which I translate for. So we have the same article in Spanish and English, and there's lots of resources that are bilingual or that might have a Spanish version of it, and maybe mixing, right? I could see, as I'm also a psychology teacher, a therapist, a family therapist, and I am a translator also. So I could see and I could relate to this way that both of the Spanish and English languages can mix and match within a person speaking or within people writing, or I mean, you can play with language and with languages, and to have sort of a mixed way of seeing things, right? And there might be some articles that are playing with language as well within psychology.
Talia?
I'm not sure, how we can define the unnegotiable, because really anything can be unnegotiable and negotiable at the same time, because how can you negotiate race? How can you negotiate class? How can you negotiate language? How can you negotiate religion? I mean, everything can potentially be unnegotiable and at the same time negotiable. So I would tend to agree with Renee that there's always a way around to negotiate if you are willing to go beyond the boundaries, not to be bounded. And I was thinking when you were talking, I'm sorry, maybe I'm shifting to another topic, so I don't want to, if you think that's irrelevant, we can leave it aside. But I was thinking what you were discussing about negotiating the conversation in your classroom, and who would you address first, and how would you translate that for children in primary school, in nursery school? Because, for example, we know so much in teaching how the teacher might devote his or her attention to a white child minutes longer than to a colored child, a child of color, or to a boy and not a girl, or social class, or and when we were hearing about Xavier this morning, what I understood that they're trying to do is that, well, what I know that they're trying to do is to get away with these categories that are there, and they predefine the children, and they want to open, and that's what's relationality in that case, to open the space for a relationship and children's stories and children's identities without imposing categories that are already there, that would identify the children as whatever, with able, not able, color, no color, whatever.
These are amazing questions. I mean, we could be here all day. I would love that. That would be the best way to spend my Friday. I think I'm hearing someone else.
I think Branka.
reminds me of Janela Bird's work on, she talks about creating space for negotiating what words mean. And it could be any word, like safety, for example, for a parent might be food and home, for a child, positive self-image, for a occupational therapist, freedom to move my body. So any words, she's saying, that needs to be nurtured. It's a skill that needs to be nurtured and developed. And it is a challenge, especially in the wider context, in the systemic issues and all that. But she kind of narrows it down to very simple conversations and very simple words, and that helps.
Ranga, could you put the name or the spelling for Jamila Birds? Thank you in the chat. Yes. All right.
Can I add a little more to something that was thinking? Because I like very much Jim Cummins. I don't know if you know Jim Cummins' definition of negotiation of identities. And to him, successful negotiation of identities is really transforming coercive power relations to collaborative relations. So I find that a very convincing definition of negotiation, and of how you empower identities when you shift from coercive to collaborative relations.
Yeah. I was having a thought, Saliha, you might be as well, others here might be also, sort of connecting back to Gabriella's question about the negotiating the non-negotiable. And Thalia, I also appreciate this comment of like, what isn't negotiable? Sort of like everything's negotiable. I would say, right, that I might speak from a place that's very different, right? I might be able to engage and negotiate the non-negotiable in ways that other professors, even in my own department, might not have the same privilege to do. Or they could do, but they might sort of face different consequences than I might, just based on social location, right? And so how I might do it might not be a way that everyone could do it. And I think that that's also like an important context, at least for me. That's my being accountable to relationality as well, is that I sort of know the place I'm speaking from and how my identity would shape how I'm able to do things. And so I wouldn't be able to give it as an answer for somebody else necessarily, right? And this is true for students as well. I mean, I teach in a program that is 85% first gen Latinx females. And so when they're asking me about, how do we step into school systems or mental health systems and challenge some of the ways we're being forced to work, there's a moment where I'm like, oh, just go in and do your own thing. Like, what's right? But I also understand there's a different consequence and context that they're having to navigate that I might not have to navigate in the same ways. So I'm just aware of that, right? Of there's different positionalities that might allow us to negotiate things in different ways.
If I can speak into that different positionalities, I think the way we think about different positionalities in the US is also getting reified. And
fair point.
Gender was like at the top of that positionality that we would talk in the US. And whenever you speak to, at least for my students of color, we're known as what is a minority serving institution, which is we get a lot of students of color. And for those of you from outside the US, student of color means anybody who is non-white,
right.
Identifies with any other. And which is interesting in itself to call it non-white. So we can get into that language game as well. I'm getting pulled into the language game. So back to the story I was saying.
It's all around us. So,
It is all around you. Language is both helpful to make sense, but it also gets in the way of making sense, right? Based on how we are contextualized and socialized. So with my students of color, when we talk about gender, for example, they would be like, but I'm a Black man. I can't separate my race, like my color, from my gender, right? And so it has always played up as we talk about gender, race, and I would say sexual orientation has been on the forefront, but we've never talked about economics. We still don't want to talk about economics. And the US has the privilege of setting the international currency against which other currencies are compared, right? And so we don't talk about nationality and the global location of the US and how it is organizing for publications, for what counts as knowledge, all of these things in terms of how it is continuing to define what is positionalities and which positionalities matter. So one offering, when you say, Justine, is of how, where are we speaking from? Talking where we're speaking from, if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen. I invariably have this PowerPoint on because I'm in most spaces speaking about this nowadays. If I can find my screen button. I use what I'm calling the relational discursive loop and speaks to Talia. Are you able to see it?
Yes.
Yep.
Speaks to Talia what you were trying to say, that this is another way to talk about where are we speaking from. Because I think when I heard you speak, Justine, to our positionalities and how we're positioned differently, I hear that dialogue, and it's about me hearing Justine rather than saying Justine is speaking from here. I hear you speaking from this particular frame that leads to a particular story from which you're saying, which goes back to who should you open up with? Should you open up with the students of color, or should you open up with white students? It's back to these framings. And this for me is where relationality comes in, that our utterances and interactions and language, which is the discursive part, Talia, that I think about, that's the discursive part, that in communication, in language, in interaction, we are organizing the social and the systemic. So it's not, it can be sedimented, and it is, and has very real effects on people's life, right? But it's also constantly in motion based on what stories we are bringing in and how we speak about it, including how we are feeling in our body and where we feel the silence and where we feel the tension. So I tend to use this as a way, in addition to talking about the pyramid of positionality, because I think our images matter. The more we keep framing it as top down, we don't see the interconnection of what relationality brings in, that we are people in the process, and that this process was made by us. And how do we maintain that process, or how do we destabilize, dismantle that process, is happening here in this moment too.
Or how the process maintains us.
And how exactly, yeah. So for me, it's this piece of where am I speaking from? But when we talk about negotiation and not negotiation, some of my friends who have identities that are marginalized will say they don't have that power to negotiate, Talia, that you're talking about. And I feel like every word choice is a moment of negotiation. How am I going to speak into it? What language to use? To come back to you, Gabriela. So one and to my Indian folks here who speak multiple languages, one of the things we do is we speak English, right? We mix English and Hindi. For me,
we call it Spanglish.
There we go.
For us, it's Spanglish.
So when you teach it,
for us.
Say that again, Talia.
Greeklish.
Wow.
So then the question comes up, would that university say you're not teaching properly if you spoke in Spanglish?
It is looked at as if like a deficiency.
Yes.
Here.
Yes.
You speak Spanglish, well, you don't speak, and especially in Puerto Ricans, they have a really negative self-image because we have an interiorized vision of the colonizer. So we see Puerto Ricans as, we see them badly when they don't speak English, and when they speak Spanish, we say, well, they're not very good at speaking English or Spanish.
Right.
Instead of looking at it as a creative thing or as something we do for survival, it's looked at badly. You're not teaching correctly. You should teach in good English or good Spanish, but there's not.
When you say it's looked at badly, for me, that's the system. Like, who is that voice that's saying that? And I see that as the making of the binary rather than the creative, like you're speaking. That when we are trying to be creative in response to these forces, we are shut down.
But if you think of Basil Bernstein's work, then even in English, inherent in English, it's the high class English, it's the working class English, and if you are born in a working class English, you know, you're done. No possibility of social mobility.
Yes. Yes, and that's the real effect I'm talking about. Like it's Marley, sorry.
Yeah, no, finish your sentence, it's fine.
No, it's just that these have very like we don't have social mobility, but we can also be made to feel very small. Like when somebody shows up with low self-esteem or say women don't want to date me. I have a client who speaks about this. Sometimes it's about the language, the way the person speaks. So yeah, Marlies.
Yeah, I mean, it just strikes me that we teach for understanding. And if the understanding is not verbal, then we have to find other ways of teaching that go beyond the words. And that for me is where you bring in the body, you bring in movement, you bring in metaphor, and you get, you use a different form of expression that is inclusive, because everybody has a story or a metaphor that they can relate to the content. So for me, I think we've got to, I mean, I'm sitting in the Canadian system, and I come from an English speaking background, but I don't understand the terminology a lot of the time, to be honest. And I'm sitting in an English system as an English speaker, but it's a different English. And the language of academia is very exclusionary. So people get kept out. And so my invitation is I write as I speak, because that is my voice and that's what I can own. And I think as in education, it's, for me, we've got to move beyond the model of everything being verbal, because it doesn't work for everybody. So that's just.
I have an idea just in this moment, Marlies, because there are lots of voices that haven't spoken. Will you play with me? Justine is used to me jumping around.
Yes, do it.
I was just wondering if people could take a piece of paper, if they feel bold enough to just, it can be just a plain piece of paper or your jotting pad, to just visually express what's it this moment feeling like, where in your body, where in your head, where in this conversation are you? How would you visually just show us? And I'm really bad at drawing, so it's not about being an artist at it. It's just an expression. It can be with words or with images. Anything you would add, Justine or Marlies, to that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a gesture.
Oh, so okay, so think of it a gesture. We can do gestures. Thank you.
It could also be a sound.
It can be a sound. I love this.
An image, a gesture, a sound. Yeah.
Sound. Okay. I love it. So just take 10 seconds. I'm going to use my bell. You're going to go into this other space and just let it come to you. When you hear the bell, just come back with that sound, image, gesture, word, whatever it might be that arrives. But where and what you're experiencing in this conversation right now. Renee, give us a second here. Okay. Wow. Let's, some people are writing, so anybody wants to put up. Talia, do hold up. Just take, I love it. Keep your movement. Gabriel has hers. Anybody who would like to unmute themselves or to share. unvideo yourself, on camera yourself. I don't know. Okay, thank you. Any sounds? What next?
Wow.
Yeah, I had a sound that immediately came to me. My sound was like, like I'm enlivened. Yes. Yeah.
I'm trying to reach out to you, to touch you, tickle you.
Anybody else who wants to speak from or just share sound or image or movement?
I just wanted to say I was going to draw something similar to what Renee drew, but I thought about giving and also just receiving what you guys are saying in this moment. But I was going to draw something similar. When I saw the picture, I was, wow, like impressed.
Connected.
I'm kind of connecting the challenges.
Can you say a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I work with these issues in a different way, where categories and culture are a safety net for the people that I work with. And so helping them to open up to the possibility of other ways of seeing their identity that is not threatening for them is really important. So sort of creating the safe space that allows them to explore and question without feeling threatened. So I work with Israeli and Palestinian teenagers who the first time they see you, they ask you who you are, where you're from, what you are.
And who are you with?
Who are you with? And that is how they determine, are you safe? Are you not safe? Will I engage with you? Will I not? And so I'm thinking about all these things and thinking of the connection. And, for me, it's bringing safety into that and going at a pace that feels safe for them is what I am thinking about.
Oh, I wish you could say more of what you're doing, Deborah.
Yeah.
I presented yesterday, but
I didn't know. I didn't see that. I would have come.
We have 2 minutes.
Okay, thank you. It was recorded, right?
Sorry.
I'm happy to connect with you afterwards at another time.
Please do, Deborah. We need to hear you. We want to hear you.
Please do, because I've been working with Palestinian and Israeli teachers.
Oh, well, I'd love to speak with you.
Yes. And I'm assuming it was recorded too. So I definitely suggest coming back and looking at each other's.
Yeah.
So
if you recorded it, Saliha, they will upload it into the webpage.
Right. So we need to pause the recording. So before we pause the recording, one word, one thought you're walking away with in addition to what you just shared.
Humanity.
Challenge.
Exploring.
Sorry, Deborah.
No. Go ahead.
Inclusion.
Expansion.
Appreciation.
And my word was gratitude. Yeah.
Yes, mine too. So I want to say thank you all.